I'm Dan Rundy. I hold a Schreier Chair here at CSIS, and I run something called the Project on Prosperity and Development. And it's a real pleasure to have friends from the U.S. government, from the People's Republic of China, and from the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves. This is being live cast by Business Fights Poverty, my friends in the United Kingdom. So big welcome to our friends overseas who are watching this. And also, I know it's also, I believe also the State Department is also live casting this as well. So we have the biographies of the speakers for those of you attending in front of you. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I just want to provide a couple framing remarks about partnerships. I think that Secretary Clinton has been really a tremendous leader on public-private partnerships in the Obama administration. She really gets it and has put her weight behind building partnerships with the private sector, multi-sector partnerships, and has provided a significant amount of leadership in this area, international development, and also thinking in different ways about diplomacy through partnerships. So it's a real pleasure to be talking about the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves within that context, and I think you'll understand why. At CSIS, our energy program hosted an event looking at the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, and in particular looking at the role of Dow Corning about 6 months ago and the energy efficiency aspects of the partnership. And as Anne Marie Slaughter, who used to be the head of policy planning at the State Department under Secretary Clinton, has talked about various forms of partnership. And one form of partnership is called an open docking form of partnership. And the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves is a form of an open docking form of partnership. And the reason we're convening today is because of a different kind of partner. We're going to be talking about both the partnership, but also the fact that there is a new important partner. The People's Republic of China has joined the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, and I think it's a direct result of the personal relationship between Secretary Clinton and the Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China. So I think it's a very exciting conversation. I think we're going to have a lot of takeaways from this discussion, but also, I'm going to start with my friend and colleague Radha Mathai, who's the Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, to provide some framing remarks about the Alliance, and then I'm going to ask Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, the Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy, to follow, and then you'll hear from Chris Balderston and from Li Bin, who's the Counselor for Economic Affairs at the Chinese Embassy. So Radha, without further ado, over to you.
Great, thanks Dan, and thanks to CSIS for hosting this event and for taking such great interest in the issue of public-private partnerships as well as the issue of clean cookstoves as well. And it's nice to see some new faces and some very familiar faces and other partners of ours here in the room as well. What I'd like to do, I think Dan's given us about 5 minutes each. As he mentioned, I'll frame the issue, and I'd like to talk about, why this is an important issue, why and what the Alliance is trying to do now, and why public-private partnerships, and in particular the partnership with China, is so important. So I'll just tee that up, not go into it in great detail, but hopefully, as I know, CSIS, we always have good, rich discussions, so I'm sure we'll get to the detail of some of this as we go forward. So why is this an important issue? There's some numbers that I'd like to throw out right at the beginning. There are about 3 billion people, so almost half of the world's population, that is reliant on some way on polluting, inefficient stoves for their daily meals. So that's 3 billion. That's a large number. Of that number, there are 2 million individuals who die annually from exposure to this harmful and toxic smoke. Now that number is far larger than those who die from HIV or TB, malaria, pick your disease. It's something that's not well known, but it's a significant number. It's also, indoor air pollution is the 5th largest health risk in the developing world. So that's another factor to throw out. The last number I'll throw at you is that every 16 seconds, someone dies from exposure to cookstove smoke. So certainly for me, these were all jarring statistics when I heard about this issue, a couple of years back as well. The other reason why this is an important issue is that it's an issue that touches not just one dimension, not just the health dimension. It touches the environment. It touches women and their ability to be empowered and contribute productively to their economies and their communities. And it also impacts it impacts health as well. So one might think that in some ways a simple solution, a clean and efficient cookstove can really address a variety of different issues all in one go. So that's really why this is an important issue. Unlike many other issues, we already have the solutions here today. So it's not that we need to, continue to think through and have research and develop, new technologies to be able to come up with a cure, quote unquote. We have multiple solutions that are readily available today that can tackle this issue. So that's the good news. The Global Alliance was formed to be able to really address and bring together the variety of different actors and players to be able to ensure that we have universal adoption of clean cook stoves. So we were launched September 2010. Dan has mentioned Secretary Clinton's pivotal role in this. She launched the alliance at that point in time. And the U.S. government has been a strongly committed partner with over 10 agencies involved in this effort in a variety of different ways. So what's the goal of the Global Alliance? Our goal is to ensure that 100 million households adopt clean cooking solutions, so stoves and fuels, by the year 2020. We're approaching this in a different way from which it was approached in the past. In the past, there have been a variety of stove giveaway programs. Those of you engaged with development organizations and NGOs have probably heard or been a part of some of these programs in the past. The approach that we're taking now is quite different. We want to develop a market. We're trying to enable a market and create a global thriving marketplace for clean cook stoves. So that's the approach that we're taking. And so whenever you think about a market, we're clearly looking at various interventions that will help enable demand, so public awareness, consumer financing, having the product available and meeting the needs of the consumers. Then looking at supply-side interventions, ensuring high-quality products that meet the needs of these consumers, including women within these value chains, and then an enabling environment. And by that, we know that markets around the world for cook stoves are not as efficient, and many are in nascent stages of development. So how do we support that development of those markets around the world? So that's what we're trying to do. How are we doing this? We're doing it through public-private partnerships. So I mentioned the U.S. government's increased and role from the beginning and how it's just increased really over the last several years. There are a variety of other bilateral players that are committed to this issue, Norway, DFID, just to name a few, but we've got about 34 different countries that are engaged in this effort already. Half of them donor countries, another half are what we call implementing countries, so countries for which clean cook stoves is a priority and an issue that they're looking to deal with. We also have a variety of private players and partners, and they could be anywhere from your large multinational corporations to your small and medium-sized entrepreneurs as well. And in fact, we think that a partnership between the large corporations and the SMEs is critical to actually reach those who need these products and ensure sustained adoption as well. I'll end just by talking about why China is so important. As I mentioned earlier, we have donor countries and we have implementing countries. China is unique in that it's a partner that straddles both of those, and it's a partner that has leadership capabilities. And we envision China actually as a leader within this alliance and being able to share with us their best practices, their learnings from one of the largest cook stove programs in the world. In fact, the largest cook stove program that they initiated in the early 1980s. So there's a lot that we can learn from China, and China has a significant manufacturing base, as we all know, and we'd like to see that manufacturing base be supportive of efforts that we're engaging in the cook stove sector, both within China as well as abroad. And China has also expressed significant interest in conducting joint research with the Alliance and a number of other bilateral partners to really build that evidence base that unequivocally shows that clean cook stoves can really empower women, can really improve and save lives, and can preserve the environment as well. So let me just leave it at that and turn it back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Radha. Assistant Administrator McCarthy, there obviously are many good reasons why the Environmental Protection Agency would be interested in the issue of clean cook stoves. When we were planning this discussion, what I was told by some of your team was that if this wasn't an issue where you actually thought you could move the needle, then it wasn't going to be worth your time. So tell us a little bit about why this is an important alliance and why this matters to the environment and why this matters to the EPA.
I will, Dan. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very excited to be here to represent Lisa Jackson in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. As many of you may know, my job is clean air. I'm the Assistant Administrator at the Office of Air and Radiation. It's my job to look at outdoor air quality as well as indoor air quality. The reason why I'm here today is because I believe that when Jacob and I were talking initially about the challenge associated with cook stoves, the numbers that Radha was talking about about the millions of women and children every year who die prematurely as a result of exposures to pollution and safety problems associated with these older, inefficient, primitive cook stoves. It made me realize just how lucky I am to be arguing about the level of particulate matter in national ambient air quality standards, which I will be arguing about on Friday. We don't realize just how lucky we are to be talking about the levels of exposures that we're talking about, and then look across the world at the challenges that others are facing, particularly women and children, in the kind of technologies we already have available to directly impact so many human lives so quickly. And to do it in a way that is creative, that does grow local economies, and that does empower people to live healthier, more productive lives. So that's why I'm here. I'm here because Lisa Jackson is infatuated with this, because she knows that Secretary Clinton is enamored of this issue and so out in front, because we have the leadership of Ambassador Verveer, who actually offered to take me to China last year, and I took her up on that offer, and we had a wonderful visit. I'm here because for 10 years EPA has been looking at this issue. 10 years ago in Johannesburg at the World Summit, we actually developed and launched an initiative that was a public-private partnership to address this very issue. Our partnership, the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air, has grown in those 10 years to garner more than 590 partner organizations across 117 countries. One of our favorites has been China. You have done wonderful work, not only because you've recognized the value it can bring to your country, but because your environmental and public health agencies have been working with us to develop some of the most robust and successful projects. So I am excited to be here. I'm excited that we're going to expand that effort. I'm looking forward to what that might mean to advance the goal of the Alliance. I think RADA has done an outstanding job at designing this as a business plan that both the private sector and the public sector can see, that has value, that has learned from lessons of the past, and that will be successful as we move forward. I think China's entrance into this in full partnership is a clear signal that we now have the foundation we need to succeed in our goal of 100 million homes adopting clean cooking solutions by 2020. And I look forward to Friday as we talk about getting better at particulate matter, and I look at the work here, recognizing that this is probably the biggest value that you can place with your time, is to devote to this effort that really will provide you a tremendous opportunity to save lives. So thank you very much for being here, and again, thank you, China, for joining in full partnership with this initiative.
Thank you, Assistant Administrator McCarthy. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Chris Balderston, who's the Special Representative for Global Partnerships at the Department of State. Chris, it's been really amazing to me to see the amount of personal diplomacy that Secretary Clinton has put into both building the alliance itself, but then also drawing upon her personal relationships in China to bring the government of China on board. Talk a little bit about her vision for the partnership, her efforts more broadly to bring the partnership together, but then I want to hear a little bit about how she's particularly involved herself in bringing in including China in this conversation from a State Department perspective.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to CSIS and my colleagues up here, Assistant Administrator McCarthy and Counselor Lee and RADA, for the work you've done. And this is a great opportunity to talk not just about how China is joining the alliance, the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, but I think it's a model for how diplomacy can work in the future. And Dan, thank you. As you know, our office was set up by the Secretary after having worked with her in the Senate. She is a believer in the power to convene, to bring people together around problems. And when we came over to the State Department, she wanted to get people together to convene around problems. And she specifically set up our office, the Global Partnership Initiative, to bring people together. And I must say one of the most exciting issues we've undertaken is this one. Administrator Jackson actually sent the secretary a note early on in the administration and said, you know, this is the biggest health problem people don't know about. And half the world cooks in open fires. You've heard the statistics from RADA, but also it's 20% of the world's black carbon. It's violence against women. A woman is raped every minute in the DRC, going out and looking for fuel for her family. A lot of women are providing what they think is nutrition to their family, but in reality, what they're doing is creating smoke indoors that is killing them. And this is an issue that the secretary, we went to her. I remember Milan Verveer and I went to her and said, you know, we need to do something about this. I think we had about 15 minutes on the schedule to talk to her about it, and I think it took us 45 seconds. She put up her hands and said, I know what you're talking about. When I was First Lady, I would travel to these villages, I'd go into their homes, and I would smell the smoke and wonder how they could live in these homes with their families. So when we came back, we announced this at the Clinton Global Initiative, and you know, we realized that a quarter of the world's problems, a quarter of the world's deaths are in Africa, a quarter in India, a quarter in China, and a quarter of the rest of the world. So one of our natural allies was to go to China, and the secretary, as Dan mentioned, brought this up at one of our strategic economic dialogues. Really, it wasn't on the agenda, but I think she felt so passionate about it that she wanted to bring it up with Councilor Dai. And she found a great partner in Councilor Dai, because Councilor Dai had told his own personal story about how his family had used Cookstoves and thought that it was an issue. So bringing them together, we added this to the Global Alliance, or we added this to our strategic economic dialogues and started talking about how we could work together to come up with the standard and the market-driven approach that Radha had explained earlier. And also to grow on the, and build on the experience that China, as the largest country that has ever taken part in distributing clean cookstoves in the 80s and 90s, to learn from them, because there are a lot of nuances here that we all don't understand, including the behavioral aspects of how do you get people to use these cookstoves. China has had this experience, and we thought it was very powerful for them to be involved in our project, and we're very, very happy that they joined last month. You know, I think we are doing in our office, the Global Partnership Initiative, a number of many interesting initiatives, many of which I'll come back and tell Dan about and try to get airtime. But this is, I think, the most sophisticated and mature. You know, to think that in 2 years we've come up with a standard, not a temporary standard, but a preliminary standard, that we have 36 countries on board, that we've raised over $100 million, that we've have a public and private sector partners, Morgan Stanley, Shell Oil, Dow Corning, and that we have NGOs on board. And we have, I should say, we've used every angle to bring attention to this. Julia Roberts is our global ambassador on clean cookstoves, and Jose Andres is our culinary ambassador. We will use every effort, every lever at our means to bring this issue to the forefront so people will understand it. The last thing I would like to say to Councilor Lee is, you know, this is the future of diplomacy. We're taking a very practical problem, and I really laud Councilor Dai and the Secretary for, you know, going off the, as Dan mentioned, going off the agenda of a strategic economic dialogue. And many of you have been in these sessions where people read and other people read, but it became a very human, personal approach. And the two talked about this. And it has created this initiative that will save lives in the world. And I think this is practical statecraft. And that's why we're here today. And that's why we came to Dan and said, you know, we need to be talking about this more. We need to be doing this in other countries. We need to see that it is possible to get things done rather than looking at these huge issues that seem insurmountable. So we're really happy here today to talk about this and thank CSES for letting us have this opportunity.
Chris, happy to be a host to this. Just a housekeeping issue. There are pieces of paper around the table. And what we're going to be doing for Q&A, to just to manage it a little bit, what I'd like to do is ask folks, if you have questions, to put them on the pieces of paper, and then I'm going to have folks collect them. So as our friend, Counselor of Economic Affairs from China, Mr. Bin, speaks, if you would please think about your questions, either as Mr. Bin speaks, but also if you have other questions more broadly. And I'll ask also an opening question, particularly for Radha, that I'm going to come back to also give you guys a few more minutes to talk about this. But let me just frame up, Mr. Bin, your comments. It seems to me that a couple things. One is that China has had an experience through using technology to get at some of the problem of this in the past, in the 1980s. You were telling me about that, and I think that's one aspect of the conversation. I think another is that China continues to have this challenge of dealing with this environmental and this environmental issue and air quality issue, but also there's also an opportunity. There's a business opportunity in the sense that both the technology aspect, but also in the sense of manufacturing, be able to have broad distribution and the ability. There may actually be business opportunities here as well, which I think we talk a lot about scale. We talk a lot about sustainability in the development sector. But in my mind, if you don't ultimately get scale or sustainability unless you have a private sector or frankly a for-profit approach oftentimes to a lot of the problems in development. So Counselor Bin, we're so pleased you're here, but perhaps you might just share your perspective, the Chinese perspective on joining the Clean Cookstoves Alliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's really my pleasure to attend this afternoon's briefing. And I think especially about how, especially to exchange views with you on the related works relating to the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstove. In the science and technology which is highly developed today, nearly half of the world's human population still depends on traditional kitchen or cookstove for cooking or heating purposes. Most of them are developing countries. The traditional solid fuel stove not only wastes energy but also emit toxic and pollutants with serious impact on health. Promoting clean cookstoves in the globe has the important meaning to realization of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, such as reducing child mortality, protecting women's health, enhancing environmental sustainability, and poverty alleviation and also reduction. We are very glad to see that as a global initiative, Global Alliance for Clean Cookstove are dedicated to promoting the development of clean and highly effective stove technology and also market globally, improving people's production and living conditions of the underdeveloped areas in developing countries, and benefit of the people of the world by carrying out extensive cooperation between public and private sectors. Under the direct leadership of State Councilor Dai Bingguo and Secretary Hillary Clinton, China formally announced a joint Global Alliance for Clean Cookstove during the fourth round of the Strategic and Economic Dialogue in May this year, and clearly identify NDRC, which is my agency. Before I came to this embassy position, I was the deputy head of the Department of Foreign Affairs at the NDRC, to take the lead in related works. The Chinese are looking forward to strengthening the cooperation with all parties under the framework of the alliance, and to deal with this global challenge and share the development opportunities together with the international community. I wish today's discussion a complete success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radha. I have a question for you as we gather up the questions from the audience. But Radha, why is it that in the Clean Cookstoves world that that we have the developing world is sort of littered with a variety of sort of failed projects in the past? Can you talk a little bit about why that is? And then could you talk a little bit about what it's going to take to sort of create the markets, to expand the for-profit markets? Because I think we are all in agreement one of the implications here from the conversations around this alliance that's going to require for-profit models to make this happen, or primarily. So if you could talk to both of those issues, they're related, but if you could speak to both of them, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. Dan refers to the fact, and I mentioned it, there have been many projects in the past that have attempted to deliver, in many cases free of charge, these stoves to be able to improve living conditions of the poor. And from the research that the Alliance has done, together with over 350 different partners and actors in this space, we've seen that there are a variety of reasons or barriers in the past, to large-scale adoption of these stoves. In many cases, these stoves were distributed, with a singular purpose. So either to address, the health issues or to address livelihood issues, without perhaps taking into full account some of the adoption-related issues as well. So in other words, you develop a product and and it's distributed, but insufficient time or training has been spent in actually helping the user understand how to transition from their more rudimentary cook stove to this cleaner or more efficient product. So that's one reason why they're littered and not used. A second reason is because in the past also we've often seen that it's a single technology sometimes, or a certain type of design that has been distributed, which often has not met the needs, the cooking needs, the food patterns, habits, etc., of those who are receiving them. So while it's nice to have a new piece of technology, if it doesn't really meet your needs, you're not going to use it. You might use it initially for a week or two, but then abandon it. A third reason that we've seen also is often in the past there have been stoves and fuels that have been, or stoves that have been provided without enough consideration to the fuel type, that is accessible to the poor in those areas as well. So for a variety of different reasons, some of these stoves have not been adopted in the past. And I think an important one, which Dan has outlined also, and I mentioned earlier, distributing free of charge doesn't necessarily carry with it a certain sense of value and purpose, to using the product. So that's a very important reason as well as to why some of these may not have been adopted before. On the issue of a market, I think we all definitely agree that the market-based approach is the right approach to take at this point in time, with the only caveat to that being, in certain humanitarian kinds of circumstances, clearly the market approach may not work in those circumstances. So just to highlight there, the Alliance is working closely with UNHCR, World Food Program, because they are the purchasers, of these cook stoves. It may be distributed free of charge, but they're certainly enabling a market by purchasing, several 100,000 of these stoves as well. So it's helping them understand, the proper standards and the types of cook stoves that they should be looking for, be it, with solar technology or, biomass or, any other form of fuel that may be used as well. What might be appropriate for the populations that they're seeking to serve, and what will actually allow for the health benefits and the efficiency that we're looking for. So in order to be able to scale a market, there are a few things that we've seen that are critical. One is obviously public awareness messaging. Why is it important to adopt a clean cook stove? And that level of messaging needs to occur at a variety of different levels. There's certainly the household and community level to ensure that the user understands that, as well as at government levels within the countries that we're engaging in, so they understand clearly how clean cook stoves can actually help contribute to other ongoing national priorities as well. So that's one thing that's critical. The second is financing, and financing on both sides of the market, if you will. Financing for suppliers, because there are a number of very good, strong, but small suppliers in the marketplace who've got great designs, but don't necessarily have the capital to be able to scale up those productions, or don't necessarily have the capacity to help market and sell these particular designs as well. I mean, very few companies, even if you look, around us in the U.S., go end to end in the value chain and have expertise all the way across. People specialize. And so what the Alliance is hoping to do is help support the brokering of partnerships between, a designer and a distributor or a marketer and grassroots organizations, women's groups that will be able to help sell these stoves, but also help build capacity in various elements of the supply chain. And then finance on the user side. Often these, clearly an improved, efficient, clean cook stove is going to cost more, than a 3-stone fire might. And so there's a whole variety of stoves out there, anywhere from, $10, $20 to $50, $60. Many of these are clearly out, at price points that are not within easy access, if you will, for the poor. So enabling some sort of financing for users is clearly important to be able to catalyze this market as well.
Thanks, Rada. I'm going to ask Chris a couple questions that we've got some very interesting questions from the audience. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I want to ask Chris, I've got two questions for you, and then I'll go to other folks as well. Can you talk about what makes the Clean Cookstoves a successful partnership, and how certainly it's one of the flagship ones for the department. Can you talk about what makes it it's successful from a State Department perspective? Can you talk a little bit
No, that's a great question. One of the reasons is it was one of the first ones that our office set up, and it has very defined goals. 100 million Cookstoves by 2020. I'm looking to Jacob Moss, who's our patron saint of Cookstoves here. And because it's furthest along, we've learned the most lessons. And I think it has such a direct impact on people. It is a huge problem. And I think, I never underestimate the power of empathy in public policy. I think it's under discussed. But I think when all of us have gone out in the field and seen this problem, there's a sense of urgency that you feel like you have to move a little more quickly. We're not making the perfect the enemy of the good. We're actually doing things. And I think that has been one of the reasons behind why this project has, I think, moved a lot quicker than others. And I should also say is we're building on some of the experiences of China and India and other countries who have done a great deal. And, we've also learned from our mistakes in the past. As Radha has put out in verse, we've learned, we were smart enough to learn from our lessons.
Talk a little bit about the interagency in the sense of how you've convened it, but also can you talk a little bit about the role of OPIC or an AID in particular from your perspective, and to the extent you're familiar at all with the Development Credit Authority, if they're playing a role. So there's this been issue of financing that Radha mentioned. There was a question here about how are you catalyzing investment capital around this? So I think of OPIC and DC as sort of public agencies that might do this, and maybe I might go to Radha and come back to you about sort of either impact investors or other folks that may be thinking about this. But go ahead.
Sure. No, that's a great question. One of the smart things we did in this project was actually go out and ask people what they thought. We created, I think we have over 300 partners now, and we actually created work groups, on women's issues and microcredit and how to distribute them locally and financing. And one of the things we took to heart was something that the Secretary created in the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy Review. And we used the whole of government. We actually had a call. Jacob and I got on the phone and we tried to figure out what agencies in the federal government did this, and we made a call and we invited them to the State Department in July of 2 years ago and brought them around the table, explained the problem, said, come back, be open, be creative, come back to us in a couple of weeks and tell us what you have. And Gina was there and gave an impassioned plea to not be a wimp and to get out there and help us out. And we did. We brought, I think we had 10 agencies come back and either offer, in-kind help or money. And I think the number is up to 105 million by federal partners. EPA, Energy, Peace Corps, USAID, CDC, NIH, all coming together and not just using their money, but starting to collaborate. The last part of your question was on financing. And, we went to, I think we have one of the most, creative OPIC administrators, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, presidents rather, in Elizabeth Littlefield. And she saw how the Secretary cared about this. And we asked her, can you come up with some creative thoughts? And she came back to us and said, we're going to do a call. And, I'm not sure we're going to get to the number we have here, because this is kind of a new area. But, she called us a few weeks later and said, hold on, we're reaching our goal here. But we're using these new financing mechanisms to try to create opportunities. We've also talked to the Development Credit Authority in South Africa about, in Lesotho, about funding a potential project down there, which would be the first clean cookstove manufacturing facility in sub-Saharan Africa. But these are things that I think if you spark the interest and the creativity of people, they're there to help us come up with these notions.
Thanks. Okay, Radha, this issue of accessing capital, certainly OPIC has got a call out, but talk a little bit about other access to finance, because a lot of this is about, okay, I'm a poor person and I need it costs me $1 to run some sort of a firewood stove of some kind or coal, but to run one of these clean cook stoves using some other alternative fuel is $30. So there's got to be some kind of a layaway plan or some kind of a long-term loan. So it's some kind of a microfinance instrument. It requires wholesaling of loans. It requires some technical assistance. It requires a whole bunch of stuff that goes into actually getting this out to rural areas. So this is not, it's easy to talk about from Washington, but actually operationalizing this, providing both the technical assistance, the capital, and the actual a market is actually not something that's so easy. So talk a little bit about the financing and how you've approached that issue.
As I mentioned, the financing is on both sides. So if I take the user side first, you referenced that, someone who's perhaps spending $1 or $2 with their traditional mud stove, and now ramping up to something that's 15 to 20 times more expensive. So what's the Alliance doing? We're working with microfinance institutions around the world. Microfinance institutions typically provide financing to what they call producer groups. So a group that is engaged in some sort of production that generates income. So you wouldn't think that typically a cook stove user, would fit within that traditional category. So we're working with microfinance institutions to help develop what's called new products for them to be able to provide these loans, to cook stove users. And the arguments that we're helping them develop the case for why this is a good investment and why they will, have returns from it. So as I mentioned earlier, there's substantial savings within a family if they were to use a more efficient and clean stove. So that income, can be used in further income generating purposes as well. So in that sense, it becomes more of a production unit. We're looking at helping microfinance institutions bundle cook stoves into larger household energy solutions or with water filtration products, sort of other products that have both the social impact as well as an impact for that household. So that's on the user side. And of course, there are various different kinds of layaway plans, if you will, that we're helping construct as well. On the supply side is where things get, really interesting, because we've got a whole array of impact investors and social investments. And those of you who are familiar with that know that there's a whole spectrum. So there's early stage investing, there's slightly more mature investing when an organization has proved their value proposition, has already showed the ability to generate a return. And then there's the usage of commercial investment, funding to truly scale up and mainstream a particular product or a particular organization. And so we're working with identifying some of those impact investors, angel investors, philanthropic investors who are interested in early stage investment. And so by early stage investment, we're talking about organizations that may have a good product, that may have a good distribution network or channel, but they haven't quite worked out a few other aspects, of their supply chain, if you will. So these are investors who are willing to help provide capacity building as well as capital and seed financing, some with a very patient horizon of 7 to 10 years in terms of when they expect a return. And what we're trying to do is also match these impact investors with your traditional donors, because we do know the importance of having, donor funds, for some capacity building. And so oftentimes investors feel comfortable investing in some aspect of the intervention, knowing that there's some support from donors to cover other aspects, of the intervention as well. The last thing I would say is that, the U.S. government, I think, whether it's AID or OPIC, has been instrumental, especially OPIC and DCA. Those two are really critical because they serve as a first loss guarantor in many cases. They provide the confidence for other investors to say, well, if OPIC's putting, $10 million into this, and they've done their due diligence, and we're sort of coming on board as a secondary investor, that provides some cover for them as well. So having that, and we're about to announce something where the Swedish government is going to do something quite similar, is really important, especially since many of the organizations in this space are fairly, they're small, medium-sized enterprises who don't have a significant track record of having borrowed and repaid, et cetera. So that's absolutely critical to what we're trying to do.
Talk a little bit, just given that this is being filmed across the ocean to our friends in Western Europe. Could you talk a little? I'm thinking about CDC, which is the UK equivalent of OPIC, or Proparco, which is the French equivalent, or FMO, which is the Dutch equivalent. Are you having conversations as part of the alliance with some of these other development finance institutions or IFC? I mean, obviously, I agree with Chris. I think Elizabeth Littlefield's really one of the most gifted public servants the United States has at the moment. Wonderful. We've had her here several times here at CSIS. But I would be curious, I think it's an interesting it'd be curious about what role other DFIs are playing or what sort of conversations you're having with them around this topic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're, as I mentioned, with the Swedish, we're about to announce in Rio a fairly significant commitment, on this topic. So
Okay.
on innovation and in working capital funding
Okay.
to be able to support the growth
Okay,
of
so watch this
enterprises around the world.
space.
Watch the space, and
Okay.
certainly we're in discussions with the help of the State Department, with CDC in the UK.
CDC, not the U.S. CDC, but
not
the
the Center for
UK
Disease
CDC,
Control,
which
but
is the
the-
OPIC of the UK, just for our viewers so that you're aware of that, right?
Correct, yeah. So no, there's a lot of exciting work in this space, and I think, one of the biggest value propositions of the Alliance is being able to broker partnerships, and that's brokering partnerships in the form of, in this case, in our discussion, financing to actual, organizations that are on the ground manufacturing these stoves and attempting to get them out to the communities that we've been talking about.
Any other announcements at Rio you wanna preview?
No, Dan, I'll leave it to Rio for next
Okay,
week.
right, okay. So you have to continue to watch this space. Okay, it's fair enough. Can you just, Rada, just taking advantage of your presence, can you talk a little bit, you guys have a $100 million household goal by 2020. How are you measuring that? I think about those, those community, in the United States, you have these community, thermometers when it gets redder as you kind of hit your goal. Do you have a thermometer on your website? How's your board, how are you guys measuring this? Where are you guys in the process of hitting your 100 million, and how are you capturing that?
I have to say that Gina mentioned the PCIA, the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air. It's, we've really leveraged and built upon all of the good work that's been done there for the last 10 years. And so PCIA does results reporting annually. And so we've been fortunate enough to be able to have as a base, their last year's results there. So, again, the definition of clean, the definition of efficient is all, is something that we're working very closely with now with the International Standards Organization to really define that more clearly and to be aspirational. I'll never forget meeting with Gina the first time, and she said, think big, think large, think aspirationally in terms of moving people up the fuel ladder so that we're not content with where we start, but we really move, the populations that we're talking about, and we have the product that will help them, achieve some of the benefits for the environment as well as for health. So we have, roughly speaking, about 2.5 million sort of efficient cook stoves out there today. We will do a lot more work to establish the baseline, for what we're considering as clean cook stoves. And yes, so we've got a significant, we like to say it's an ambitious but achievable goal, to get to the 100 million by the year 2020, so roughly about 8 years or so to get there. The monitoring and evaluation is absolutely critical. In fact, we have a balanced scorecard that helps us track on an annual basis where we are, both from that 50,000 foot level, how are we going from 2.5 million to 100 million. But our mission talks about saving lives, improving livelihoods, empowering women, and preserving the environment. So we've got a number of different indicators that we track along each of those dimensions to do that. And the one other principle of the Alliance is not reinventing the wheel. So we're using a lot of the tools that have been used in the water sanitation world and the vaccine world to be able to really understand and evaluate and monitor the adoption of these stoves, at the local level as well.
Let me just get one more question to you, and then I want to ask a question for the panel about China. But can you, to fix these things, there's a maintenance and training aspect to this stuff. This is and I think it comes across in some of the questions about maintenance and training. How do you? Okay, so it's one thing. There are good reasons why people chop down trees, and I'm not saying they're great reasons. I'm saying they're understandable reasons why people do this. It's easy. It's cheap, or it's ostensibly cheap. It's ostensibly around. There are issues of what happens when these things break down. How do you fix? This is the same thing around water systems, right? And there's reasons why. I'm not saying it's good, but there's a logic to it. How about that? That may be perhaps another way to say it. There's a logic to it. And I think there are some concerns, and it comes across in some of the questions around, okay, well, how are we going to maintain, and how do you train? And this is also comes up, as you know, in water systems and wells and this sort of a thing. So talk just a little bit more about that, and then I want to have a question about China for everybody.
I'm looking at Justin there because he's with Ambassador Verveer's office, and we've been working very closely about, including women in value chains, in the cook stove value chain. And there's a reason for doing that. In the beginning, you include women so that they're designing products that they would like to use themselves, from that perspective. And then women are more likely to purchase from other women as well. And so the idea of including women in the cook stove value chain throughout, and for what we'd call after-sales maintenance as well, is critical. So we're definitely, as an alliance, a huge proponent of a variety of different market-based approaches to be able to scale up the adoption of stoves. But one thing that we've seen through various pilots and research studies are that, you increase your rates of adoption when women are involved in some aspect of that value chain. And you want to make sure that those who've helped design it are around and they can help support with the maintenance of these stoves as well.
Thanks. Okay. So I want to ask each of you to talk about what it means to just a little bit further about what it means to have China as part of this alliance. And so why don't I start with Assistant Administrator McCarthy first. If you could just speak to why you think why it's so important to have China as part of this alliance.
Yeah, let me just make clear that we hope to learn a great deal from China's experience. We have worked with them in the past, and they have proven to have a very sort of well-developed understanding of how you need to design a stove technology that actually fits the culture of the communities that you are attempting to serve. And I think that their wealth of experience, as well as their sheer ability to bring numbers to the table, will be tremendously important. And I think the last thing I wanted to mention is that, I think it's very simplistic to think that cook stoves are just cook stoves. They are not just cook stoves. And there are many women and girls who spend countless hours every day just finding wood to put in those stoves. They are deferring educational opportunities. They are finding that cook stoves that are new and efficient are not just allowing them to have more complete and healthy lives, but we're also able to marry a cook stove with an ability to sterilize water. There are ways in which a cook stove initiative can be so much broader than cook stoves themselves. And I think that we have an opportunity with China to really begin to flourish and to make this not just about meeting our cook stove goal, but actually bringing to life that kind of economic development aspect of this that will be so beneficial to developing countries.
Councilor Ben, just talk a little bit more about what attracted China to participate in this, and sort of you just to talk a little bit more about its experience, but also what it hopes to share with the rest of the world about its experience, if you would, please.
China is the largest.
Just the microphone.
China is the largest developing country in the world. China is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world. And China, actually, we have this obligation to do this. And China is also capable of doing this. Why do we say that? Actually, China is a country that promoted the large-scale application of clean stove at an early stage. In the early 1980s, China implemented the so-called promoting wood and coal-saving stove projects in rural areas. And we tried many efforts to strengthen the popularity and also the promotion of clean fuel and also the stoves. After nearly 30 years of efforts, the national rural areas has already popularized 189 million wood and coal-saving stoves accumulatively, and has obtained the remarkable energy saving and emission reduction effect. So to solve the health problems brought by the use of the traditional stoves, we also conducted the project of changing cooking stoves and also reducing fluoride level in the national scope, and also popularized about 15 kinds of outstanding stoves suitable for different kind of attitude, of different kinds of coal, of different kinds of uses, greatly reducing the local fluoride poisoning effects or phenomena. and effectively protect the local farmers, especially women and children's health. And we believe that China's domestic effective action that we have just mentioned will make an important contribution to the alliance to and the actions that we'll take in the future will make great contributions to the alliance to realize its target that 100 million units or families in the globe will utilize clean stoves and also clean fuel by 2020.
Thank you. Could you just also, Councilman, talk a little bit about how Minister Dai, in terms of just the perspective from China, in the sense that there's certainly a lot of sense here in Washington that this is partially driven by the personal relationship between Secretary Clinton and Minister Dai. Can you speak at all about that in terms of when you talk to your counterparts back in Beijing? Certainly there's the great technological sharing of experience that China has to offer, and many of the points that you've just shared. But could you just talk a little bit about, does the personal relationship matter? Did that play a factor in China joining the alliance?
Personal relationship certainly matters because Minister Dai and also Mr. Clinton have a very good personal relationship. They actually talk a lot in the so-called strategic part of the dialogue. And Wang Qishan and also Geithner, they were on the economic track of the field. And I think this personal relationship really matters. And even when I'm back in China, I did not expect that announcement would be made, because we didn't have the opportunity to listen to their speeches even during or even some of the work before, even some of the work prepared for the strategic dialogue. So I was very pleased, I was very pleasant and surprised to see that such a announcement was made. And but I also think that China has also taken into consideration some of the other factors, which is something that I have mentioned. That is, China has done something in the past. We are capable of doing that. We can make more contributions in the future. We have the technology. We have the manufacturing capability. China is a manufacturing plant in the world, and we can certainly, again, make another contribution to the world by making, doing another 189 million families, or maybe more, or maybe better quality.
Well, I look forward to coming back and getting a progress report on the collective work of the Global Alliance for Clean Cookstoves, and we're so pleased to be able to host the announcement or the rollout of China joining the alliance, and we're very much looking forward to hearing of the incredible contributions that China will be making to this alliance. Thank you all so much for being with us, and please join me in thanking the panelists.